Welcome to the Binary Agora. I'm your host, Alba Rivera Martinez, and today I want to pick your interest with something that you may have experienced when interacting with an AI chatbot. So it's true that we are more aware of the potential displacement that AI can operate with regards to the workforce, for instance. However, there are other types of phenomena that we unconsciously incorporate into our psyche when we interact with LLMs. And think about writing a summary of a paper or even a report that you have to circulate with a colleague of yours. I guess that you'll use an LLM to speed up the process, to try to turn it out as quickly as possible, and there's nothing inherently problematic with that. But when translating that information into the Word document you'll be sending to your colleague, I guess that you will also try to adjust the language so that it sounds more human-like. And in the same vein, for instance, when I am writing, I personally avoid including clauses in threes and have also dropped the word delf from my vocabulary so as to try to avoid that my research sounds a bit AI generated. So to talk about this innate and unconscious pattern that we have increasingly seen with our daily lives and our work practice, we have with us today Valerio Capraro. He's an associate professor at the University of Milan Bicocca. He uses human experiments, mathematical modeling, and numerical simulations to understand human behavior. And he has published over 80 research papers in leading peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, Human Behavior, and PNAS. So welcome to the Agora, Valerio.
Thank you, Alba. Looking forward to our conversations.
Thank you so much for joining us, Valerio. And going straight into this discussion, I wanted to ask you first to flesh out a bit what you are referring to when you talk about this idea of LLMorphism.
Yeah, so LLMorphism is defined as the biased belief that human cognition works like a large language model. The basic idea is very simple. For years, we worried that people were attributing too much mind to machines, and this is what the so-called anthropomorphism. And I argue that now there is a reverse risk. Because machines can produce human-like language, people may start believing that humans think like machines. So this is the reverse step. It's called mechanomorphism. And LLMorphism refers to a particular specific form of mechanomorphism, which I argue is caused by the fact that LLMs and humans produce remarkably similar linguistic outputs. So now this inference is understandable, but it's not logically valid because similarity in linguistic output does not imply similarity in cognitive architecture. We are embodied organisms, we have emotions, we have needs. We are aware of our own mortality, while LLMs do not. We have another paper with Walter Quattrociocchi and Matthias Perk, where we highlight 7 fault lines between human and artificial intelligence. These are lines where these two forms of intelligence fundamentally diverge, and ultimately, we can say that human intelligence is teleological, meaning that it is organized around goals, needs, fears, desires, survival, reproduction, meaning, while artificial intelligence is ateological. It can generate solutions without having intrinsic goals or ends. Yet, because language is the main way cognition becomes visible, it is tempting to conclude that if the outputs look similar, the underlying processes must also be similar. This temptation is what I call LLMorphism.
Following the publication of your paper, many people and several media agencies adopted this term ahead to explain this unconscious situation that we had all faced. And in this sense, you argue in the paper that the public debate on AI is missing half of the problem because it is focused on giving too much of a human mind to machines whilst ignoring the effects on the minds of humans. So how does LLMorphism fit into the narrative, and what examples can you think of that not only account for these anecdotal experiences but rather more substantial impacts on humans, and whether you think that we are losing about ourselves in all of this process?
Most of the debate focuses on anthropomorphism. So are we giving too much mind to machines? So this is the anthropomorphic question. And this is a very important question. I'm not denying it at all. I'm just arguing and adding that there is another important question, whether we are taking too much mind away from humans. So somehow anthropomorphism means raising machines up to the level of humans, while LLMorphism means reducing humans down to the level of machines, and LLMs in particular. Now, historically, technologies have often served as metaphors for the mind, but now we are increasingly describing the human mind using the vocabulary of LLMs like prediction, prompting, pattern completion, hallucination, training data. And I argue that this might be problematic. Of course, the danger is not merely linguistic. The danger is that these metaphors can reshape how we understand ourselves. So if creativity becomes just recombination, if expertise becomes just text generation, if reasoning becomes just next token prediction, then the risk is that we flatten human cognition into something narrower than it actually is. Therefore, we may lose, for example, the appreciation of agency, responsibility, embodiment, judgment, lived experience. Thinking about specific examples, for example, in the domain of mental health, LLMorphism can encourage the idea that emotional distress is simply a matter of generating the right verbal patterns. So this risks overlooking the embodied, relational, and experiential dimensions of suffering that cannot be reduced to language generation. So a broad risk here is that we risk confusing speaking with understand.
And technologies, as you said, have always reshaped how humans understand themselves, notably through clocks, steam engines, or computers. And I was wondering, is LLMorphism the latest iteration of this very old story that we have been interacting with technology for some time now? Or is it something genuinely unprecedented happening at this time with AI?
I think it's both. Humans have always understood themselves through their most advanced technologies. This has happened with clocks, steam engines, computers, and so on. Each of them became a metaphor of the mind. The new part is that language itself is now being automated. So while previous technologies automated physical work or computation, LLMs automate something much closer to what we typically associate with thought. It automates explanation, argument, storytelling, justification. And because language is the primary medium through which human cognition becomes visible, LLMs then occupy a uniquely privileged position, if we can say so. They compete with us in the very domain through which we recognize minds. So this makes the risk of reverse projection, mechanomorphism, much stronger than before. So if I had to summarize, I would say that the qualitative mechanism is not new. Scholars have been speaking about mechanomorphism since the 1940s. So the qualitative mechanism is not new, but its quantitative activation might be much stronger.
And in terms of impacts, I wanted to pick your mind on two different fronts regarding two narratives regarding bargaining and concentration of power that we have really discussed on the channel. So from a top-down approach in the paper, you argue that LLMorphism could make humans look replaceable. So I wanted to ask, is it generally a new threat to human dignity, or is it providing the intellectual cover for something that was already happening? So for instance, the fact that corporations already treated workers as interchangeable long before AI was adopted within the market.
I think it's mostly the latter. Organizations were treating workers as interchangeable long before AI. Think about Taylorism, bureaucracy, algorithmic management. Of course, none of them began with ChatGPT. What LLMorphism may provide is a new justification. If workers are viewed as output generators, then replacing them can start to appear not only economically efficient, but conceptually justifiable, natural. And the negative consequence is that we may stop asking what makes human work distinct. For example, tacit knowledge, responsibility, judgment, relationships, care, wisdom, all of this can become invisible because they are harder to quantify than outputs. So again, to summarize, LLMorphism may not create the problem, but it may legitimize it.
Standing from the other perspective, from a bottom-up approach, you also mentioned within the paper that gender, education, and occupation can act as potential moderators to LLM adoption. So is there a version of LLM morphism that the privileged impose on others, where powerful institutions start seeing lower status workers as LLM-like while protecting more fully human self-image or themselves?
I think this is a very plausible risk because historically, powerful groups often reserve full humanity for themselves while describing others in more mechanistic terms. Therefore, one can imagine a future in which routine workers are evaluated primarily through measurable outputs and increasingly viewed as replaceable, while executives, leaders, artists, intellectuals continue to be described using richer concepts such as vision, judgment, intuition, creativity. If that happens, LLMorphism would not simply be a cognitive bias, it would become a political and social tool. It could contribute to a world in which some people are treated as agents and others as generators. This is a serious possibility that deserves empirical attention.
To finish off the presentation in the spirit of finding a potential way out, you note that more LLM exposure might increase LLM morphism, but it can also decrease it through better technical understanding. So, what does the evidence so far suggest, and do you think that this is the right path forward?
Yeah, so the evidence is not available yet, mainly because this concept of LLMorphism has just been introduced. So, for example, with some of my students, we are uh, trying to address some of the questions raised in the paper. Coming to your question specifically, I think there are two competing predictions. On the one hand, greater exposure might increase LLMorphism because the analogy becomes more familiar and cognitively available. For example, when I speak with my mom or my dad who don't use LLMs, they don't think that their mind works like an LLM because they don't even know what an LLM is. But there's also the other prediction that greater understanding reduces LLMorphism because people learn how these systems actually work and become more aware of the differences between human cognition and machine architecture. It's possible that the effect is non-linear, like an inverted U effect of exposure to LLMorphism. Alternatively, it's possible that exposure in itself is not enough, and what matters more is understanding how these systems work. And I think the goal should not be to convince people that humans and machines are completely different, but to help them understand similarities and differences. I think the antidote to LLMorphism is not an anti-AI sentiment, a general anti-AI sentiment, but it's more indeed understanding, conceptual precision. Our epistemological fault lines between human and artificial intelligence paper that I mentioned before with Walter Quattrociocchi and Matthias Perk, we also introduced the notion of epistemic literacy, and we think it will be important in the future to teach the epistemic steps that humans and machines typically perform to make people understand similarity and differences between these two systems. And we believe that this skill, epistemic literacy, will be crucial in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Valerio, for sharing all of these ideas with us, all of these thoughts. For the viewership, do not forget to subscribe, to like the video, to rate the video, and to join us here in the Agora in the next episode. So thank you so much, Valerio, for everything, and see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you, Alba, for having me here.